New Thinking Aloud is presented by the California Institute for Human Science, a fully accredited university offering distant learning graduate degrees that focus on mind, body, and spirit. The topics that we cover here. We are particularly excited to announce new degrees emphasizing parapsychology and the paranormal. Visit their website at cihs.edu.
Thinking Aloud. Conversations on the leading edge of knowledge and discovery with psychologist Jeffrey Mishlove.
Hello and welcome. I'm Jeffrey Mishlove. Today we'll be exploring the Global Consciousness Project. I'm pleased to be with Dr. Roger D. Nelson, who was the director of the Global Consciousness Project, an international multi-laboratory collaboration founded in 1997, which aimed to study collective consciousness. From 1980 to 2002, he was coordinator of research at the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Laboratory at Princeton University. He is a longtime board member and past president of the Parapsychological Association. Once again, this interview has been conducted over the internet, and I'm going to switch over to that channel now. Welcome, Roger. It's a pleasure to be with you. I think a good way to introduce your work might be to start right at the beginning. I think you joined the PAIR unit at Princeton, the Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research Unit in 1980, I believe.
That's right. I was teaching in a small college in northern Vermont and becoming a little concerned about the direction that place was going and interested in research. I started poking around, and a friend of mine gave me some ads to look at, one of which was this place in Princeton, New Jersey, Princeton University, which I had heard of. Yeah. And they were looking for a cognitive scientist interested in the lesser-known aspects of perception. And naturally, I thought of the sense of smell and touch and that sort of thing. And it turned out to be a great deal more interesting. It was the beginnings of what was called the PAIR Lab, Princeton Engineering Anomalies Research, which was looking at consciousness. And I was interested in that. I was vastly more interested in that than in aromas. And
you were a professor of psychology, and I believe your background also includes physics and engineering.
Yes, I was a good student in high school, and when I went to college, I couldn't decide whether I wanted to be a physicist or a chemist, and eventually I became a sculptor. I didn't have time for the physics, and so I switched to become a psychology major, or a sculpture major with a psychology minor, and then years later, I went to graduate school to take the psychology part much further. Mm-hmm.
So at Princeton, under the direction of Robert John, you became engaged in a program that lasted for a couple of decades using random event generators for measuring what parapsychologists call psi.
Right. Random number generators, well, they weren't invented by Helmut Schmidt, but he put them on the map. Mm-hmm. He started doing experiments when he was an engineer working for Boeing. He became very interested in the fact that they didn't seem always to be random, and he eventually correlated that with his state of mind and his intentions. And so he set about making some really good experiments to test whether these kind of accidental observations made sense or could be validated. And not so long after that, Bob John took up more or less the same set of questions as an engineer, trying to find out if there was any reason to believe that human consciousness could interact with random number generators or sensitive technology in general, because he was an aerospace engineer, among other things, and knew that we should be concerned about all the technology in cockpits of fighter aircraft, for example, which get to be very intense places psychologically.
Mm-hmm. I guess the development of the random number generator or the random event generator came out of criticisms, I think, of the early card guessing experiments by J.B. Rhine, having to do with the idea that simply shuffling a deck of cards didn't produce an adequately random sample of targets.
Right. I guess there are a number of motivations or sources of that work, but as our technology advanced, as we became more engaged in an electronic world with computers and so forth, it became quite reasonable to think if we want to study consciousness and the sort of at the limits, what can consciousness actually do in the world? Then using the best modern technology seemed to make a lot of sense. And that is maybe a very good description of random number generators in this kind of application. They can be made to operate as if they were a theoretical device. We can't tell the difference between a good random number generator, the output of a good random number generator, and the theoretical expectation, unless you get some human being there with conscious intention to somehow change the way the world runs in this very refined technological space, to come up with something like mind-machine interaction. Mm-hmm. Very fine tools.
Well, and perhaps for the benefit of our viewers, could you explain the difference between a random number generator and a pseudo-random number generator?
Right. Well, the kind of random number generators almost all of Sci researchers use are what we call true random number generators or physical random number generators. They use, in most cases, some quantum process. It might be radioactive decay, or it might be something like pushing electrons against a barrier in an electronic circuit, which produces a tiny voltage that shouldn't happen on the other side of the barrier. This is the kind that we used in the Pear Lab. What we do is set up a circuit to, as I said, push electrons against a switch barrier inside the diode. This tiny voltage that develops on the other side comes from what's called quantum tunneling, where a few electrons somehow, even though they aren't supposed to belong in that barrier, wind up on the other side of it. Has to do with complicated quantum processes. So in any case, a tiny voltage that's completely unpredictable develops on the other side of the barrier. We sample that and turn the high voltages into ones and the low voltages into zeros. And the whole thing is engineered so that it is completely unbiased and becomes a high-speed electronic coin flipper that produces pretty much exactly 50-50 on average, ones and zeros. Now, a computer and I should just emphasize again that the underlying process is completely unpredictable. It is a quantum process, and there is no way that even that process knows what the future will be. So nobody can predict it. It comes into being only when it happens. Mm-hmm. A computer program that may produce what's called pseudo-random number generators is deterministic. It has an algorithm. So you push the button to start that algorithm, perhaps with some random seed, and then the algorithm cranks out what looks like a series of random numbers, but they are actually totally determined by the equations of the algorithm.
Both of these have been used for research purposes, but I guess a pure random event or random number generator is preferable.
Well, it's preferable because it has this quality of being utterly unpredictable.
Yeah.
There isn't, any way you can change its behavior other than by intervening in a quantum process that we don't even know how to describe except mathematically. So
go ahead.
They're preferable because they are predictably unpredictable. As I mentioned earlier, they say they do what they're supposed to do theoretically.
They are therefore very reliable.
Well, yes, the good ones, and people shouldn't do research with anything but the best quality instrument. They cost, the best quality in electronics is a very small price to pay in order to have a reliable instrument. So a well-designed, well-executed random number generator will do what it's supposed to do. And even though we have control conditions in most of our experiments, it is possible with good random number generators to compare the behavior of the device in an experimental situation where somebody is trying to get more ones or more zeros. It's possible to compare what happens against the theoretical expectation if it's a really good quality random number generator.
Mm-hmm. Or I suppose if there's any uncertainty, you can run a control group.
Right. We in the Pear Lab and also in the Global Consciousness Project always do control tests or what we call calibrations. And in the Pear Lab experiments, we usually use what we call a three-way or tripolar protocol that had a high intention, a low intention, and a baseline. So the high intention is exactly what it sounds like. Try to get high numbers. By the way, we weren't asking people to change ones and zeros. We were gathering 200 ones and zeros, 200 bits into a trial. And we asked people to try to change the outcome or the mean value of those trials to become higher or lower than 100, which is the expected value. Mm-hmm. So the baselines, what we told people for the baselines is let the machine do what it does, let it be. Mm-hmm. It turned out that lots of people in our somewhat irascible crew of operators, we call them, not subjects, tried very hard to get good baselines, and they did. Mm-hmm. The baseline variance was smaller than it should have been in much of the pair database, apparently because people were trying to, make it come out kind of 50-50 exactly.
I see. So what we're talking about, I guess, most parapsychologists would call psychokinesis, an effort of human intention to influence this mechanical instrument, quantum mechanical instrument, without touching it in any way.
That's right. I mean, we in the Pear Lab tended to use what we thought of as kind of engineering language. We didn't talk about PK much, but mostly about anomalous interactions or human-machine interactions, or sometimes mind-machines interactions. In any case, the idea was that there was going to be some kind of connection made or achieved between the mind and the intentions of the person who's operating in our experiments and what happens to the data produced by these well-designed random number generators.
Another interpretation that's been offered, I think, for that research is that it's something called decision augmentation rather than psychokinesis, suggesting, I guess, a precognitive effect of some sort.
Right. It's a good model, partly because it's testable. And the idea is that somehow the mind can reach out to determine what the outcome of the experiment might be. And having that information about the future state of the system to press the button at the right time to achieve that state. Now, it's a pretty, as I mentioned, it's a testable model. It's pretty interesting, and lots of people have worked hard to determine whether that explains things well or not. And it has, to my mind, made even more complicated a situation which is already very difficult to understand.
Mm-hmm.
The idea that reaching into the future to get information about the future state of the system so you can manipulate the system now in order to achieve that sounds loopy.
Yeah.
But it's not loopy in the in the strong sense.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of data fit that model. It turns out that the pair data do not fit that model. The psychokinesis or random number generator data actually fit better a model of something that we never did think of as a kind of force-like intervention, but a field-like intervention, possibly something like the consciousness of the content or the intent in the consciousness somehow interacts with the system to produce changes or achieve changes. And nobody, I think, has ever satisfactorily determined what particular kind of model really best explains these kinds of things. So I hope this kind of research goes on into the future with more bright minds focused on it, because it's really an extraordinarily interesting thing. Are we reaching into the future and changing our present on the basis of future or precognized information? Or are we interacting with the physical world in which we now are embedded in some fashion, connecting our mental state, our mind, to the physical world?
In either case, any conventional interpretation involving electromagnetic signaling has been ruled out.
It has been pretty nicely. Yeah. I think there's always a little. One has to be careful about never say never. Mm-hmm. So it's possible that there might be some aspect. And by the way, we're close also to another set of questions and propositions having to do with where does this effect come from. A lot of people, and I think scientists are especially prone to this, look for a single source. So it could be that something like this future information acquisition, the precognition of the future, might be a part of the situation. Certainly the intentions of not just the person who's called a subject or an operator, but of other people involved in the experiment may be actually instrumental or part of the system. Now, I'd like to think there are 4 different pieces to whatever one of these kind of unusual events or outcomes in an experiment is. One would be the nominal source, the thing that comes to mind, the operator or the subject sitting there saying, high numbers, please, I want high numbers. Or the experimenter who would like the experiment to be interesting and may not be in the room or even in any way aware of what's actually happening, but nevertheless has a vested interest, a kind of intention contract with the experiment, so to speak. And then there's something drawn really from what we learned in physics in the last 100 years. The nature of the question you asked is very important. So part of the determination of what the outcome is will be the form you use for the question. And then finally, I think that the universe laughs at us sometimes. In order to keep our hubris at a modest level, we have something that I think of as a kind of coyote which helps to explain why your experiment is going along wonderfully well, and then all of a sudden the results come out backwards for a while. Why would that be? And we don't know why that would be. But it could be that we need not to get ahead of ourselves. We need not to conclude that we know how it all works, because we don't yet know.
Another possibility, I suppose, is that every person who reads about the experiment or learns of it, even people watching our interview today, could be having a retrocognitive psychokinetic influence on that experiment.
My God, you're a theorist, Jeff. Yeah, there are actually pretty serious efforts to embody those kinds of thoughts. If there's an observer effect, and if it can operate retroactively, then there's, in some sense, some difficulty in limiting the number of stages of retroactive observation that might influence the data that we get.
Yeah. Yeah. So these studies at Princeton University ran for about 20 years. You accumulated an enormous amount of data. Many, many publications occurred. And then at some point that research project sort of ran its course, and you established a new program, the Global Consciousness Project.
Right. I actually started that in 1997, about 10 years before the Pear Lab closed. It was not quite 3 decades, 27 years, actually, that the lab was in business. I retired from the lab in 2002 and really began I had already been giving a lot of time to the Global Consciousness Project, but then my wife said, "You're not retired. Don't kid yourself," because I was deeply engaged in making the Global Consciousness Project grow and prosper.
Mm-hmm. Well, and to sort of introduce people to the Global Consciousness Project, is probably useful to go back once again to the definition of the true random event generator and point out that somehow it seems as if the human consciousness is interacting with the device at a quantum physical level.
Right. There is a sort of a step between the Pear Lab and the Global Consciousness Project that's quite helpful, I think, in thinking about this. We miniaturized things, gradually getting an ability to give other people random number generators so they could do replications or do their own studies, and also ourselves to go out in the field with what ultimately became very tiny devices, which were perfectly good, high-quality random number generators, but now they were way smaller than the proverbial cigarette pack. They're more like a pack of matches in size. And with laptop computers getting smaller and smaller, we actually used for several years what were called palm-top computers. They were the first really portable ones. I carried them to Egypt. I carried them to Devil's Tower in Wyoming. My friends Bob and Brenda took them to the Metropolitan Opera. And in all cases, what we did was take continuous data, a stream of random numbers, a sequence that was unpredictable. Remember, these devices just do what they do. And we had, for various reasons, come to believe that if there was an intense kind of coherence among the people who were involved in something like an opera, the great arias bring people together, and everybody is singing the same tune, so to speak.
And having a strong emotional response,
yes,
presumably, yeah.
And what we've predicted and found was that if there is a high degree of coherence in a group of people, that a random number generator in their presence, even though they may not be paying attention or even know it's there, that random number generator may begin to produce deviant data sequences. So we called that experiment the field REG, or field reg experiment. It was actually doing two things, a kind of double entendre. It was doing work in the field, but our model that we thought we were testing, and I still think we were testing, is that consciousness produces a kind of field. we can name it a consciousness field or call it more usefully an information field. But it actually, in some theoretical musings that I and others do, constitutes a potential source for structuring information that might be absorbed into an unstructured random event sequence. So what we found was that random data that should be a sequence wandering without any direction, a kind of drunkard's walk, that it might take on a trend and exceed the boundaries of what's likely for a true random number generator.
And you began to get positive data using the field REG studies. I should point out also that for people who may not know, REG, random event generator, is often used synonymously with RNG, random number generator.
Right. Yeah, so we actually did a lot of those field REG experiments, and they added up tremendously. The effect size was, if you calculate it in a certain way that makes sense to me, in terms of how much time is invested in producing it, it's a larger effect than what we saw in the laboratory experiments on average.
I see.
But we're talking about identified events where we expect there to be a resonant gathering of mind or emotion, a coherence among the people. That's a definitional quality. We also did control data. We went to shopping centers and railway stations and places where there's a buzz and a lot of activity, but no coherence. And in those places, we found no deviation from the normal random sequences.
And I suppose, it makes sense at one level. At another level, that people have argued, and I think it might be the case, that maybe just a single person is actually influencing it, the experimenter who knows what the conditions are. Right.
There are plenty of people who think that. And because I was involved in those experiments, I've thought about it quite a bit. And so one way of dealing with this is to do the best you can to get the experimenter out of the experiment. So you can set up experiments where you give the device to somebody else who then goes to the meditation session or the fabulous concert or whatever it is, and then you get the data back and do the analysis and so on. Of course, the experimenter is still involved. But I think I want to go back to this idea that there's multiple sources. Yes, the experimenter is involved. You can't have an experiment unless you ask a question. So that's what the experimenter is doing, and that question inescapably becomes a kind of cultivating factor or a discriminating imposition when you start looking at the experiment as a whole. We just have to accept that, and then try to do experiments that have the experimenter more and more distant from the operational experiment itself. And I think the Global Consciousness Project does that quite nicely in some respects, although there are people who think that's all Roger Nelson. I just don't believe it. Oh, I should mention, by the way, that Roger Nelson's signature of achievement in dealing with random number generators is pretty modest.
Well, and that's useful data. And since you mentioned the word signature, I am reminded of an old study Dean Radin did where he used a neural network to look at what he called, I think, the psi signature of different operators in a random event generator. And he took the results and divided them in two and used a neural network to see if they could match up the first half with the second half. And indeed, it was statistically significant, and it does suggest that each operator, as you call them, has a unique signature that can be recognized.
Yeah, we had pretty good evidence for that in the lab, even before Dean's beautiful experiment with the neural networks, admirable sort of confirmation of what we already knew from other more, well, I guess you would say simpler analyses. Mm-hmm. The truth is that we are all individuals, and we have, if you go through life, you will meet people that you resonate with, and others where that doesn't happen. You become friends in one case, and not so much in the other case. And the same thing seems to be true with experiments of this kind. There is a kind of, I don't know whether I should say it's anthropomorphic quality, but our operators would often say, in order for me to make my intentions known, I have to communicate with this device you've got sitting on the table. And the best way for us to get together and produce what we're trying to do here is to love this device, feel some real emotional connection to it. And I think, even though we never did a formal kind of study to prove this, our database of 100 operators or 130 or something like that altogether, they became friends of the lab. They weren't treated like lab animals, but instead as kind of co-workers in the field of trying to figure out what's going on. Mm-hmm. And so we learned from them by asking, how was it? What do you think is happening? And how do you do what you do? And a lot of people would say, I really just have to connect. Mm. We had one particularly nice example of a certain form of that. We had one of the people that actually worked in the lab quite a bit. Tried, and she wasn't having very much success. And so finally she got discouraged and said, well, I'm going to go ahead and do some more data, but I'm going to read a magazine. And so, of course, she got terrific results by doing that. And then she went on to do quite a few more of these individual experiments using this new mode of getting out of the way by reading a magazine, set the intention, and then let it be. Mm-hmm. That was one of the things that I think one of the clearest messages we got from these experiments about how to, go ahead and how to engage in an impossible task. Mm-hmm. Do the best you can, but the best you can do is to set the intention and then get out of your own way.
Well, it sounds like good advice, and I can think of many other examples where it's applicable in many other human activities, as a matter of fact. But now let's talk more about the Global Consciousness Project, because with that, you took the whole research paradigm to another level.
Right. The idea that some of the questions that arose when we're doing these field experiments had to do with what would happen if the group that I'm monitoring is far away. What would happen if I had 2 REGs there or 10? And so I had been thinking about, I'm a great fan of Teilhard de Chardin, and I long ago came to believe that he was quite right about human beings being unfinished in terms of evolution, and we would have another stage, and that he called to become the noosphere, a sheath of intelligence for the Earth. And so that kind of thinking was rattling around, and at the same time I was doing these field consciousness experiments, and they came together as the idea to have to take the big step and see if we can't look for a global consciousness, a kind of, maybe very inchoate or very young global consciousness, but we might just say, give it a whirl. And the idea was that in the world there are events that, like a great concert and the field experiments, bring huge numbers of people into the same state of mind and the same set of emotions. So if there's a terrible, terrible tragedy, a zillion people will feel kind of compassion and empathy and so forth. And because of our modern technological mastery of the communication world, that happens kind of close to instantaneously all over the world. So my thought was, let's do a giant version of the field REG by making a permanent network of random number generators sitting in places all around the world and sending data back to a server in Princeton to be gathered into an archive that can then later be examined during events of great significance to see whether there's any change in the data. Mm-hmm. And that's the simple explanation of why and then what we wound up doing in the Global Consciousness Project. So several friends and many people in the parapsychology community became interested in this idea, and several of us worked together to think about protocols and so forth, and then some people volunteered to host one of these devices, which came to be called REGs, and it's a nice sort of segue to the first name of that project, which was the REG project. It was my son was a master programmer, and he did the architecture for all the software necessary to bring, to collect the data and then bring it to the archive. And he said, what you're doing is a little bit like an EEG. It's like the electroencephalogram has a whole bunch of sensors stuck on a skull that's attempting to get some idea of what's going on inside. So he says, of course, these aren't electronic devices in the sense that they're measuring anything electrical, but your paradigm is very much like that. So let's think of it as an electrogaiagram. So Gaia being the name for the Earth that has been long used. So that acronym for that, of course, is EGG. We thought it was too playful to use as a formal name, so we gave the project the Global Consciousness Project name. But our devices have been called REGs ever since. The archiving program that runs on the central computer is called a basket, of course. It collects the data from the REGs.
So, and this has been running now for over 15 years. Maybe
right.
close to 20, I guess.
Yeah, it's 20 years, actually. Mm-hmm. It started in August of 1998, gathering data. And we are now past August in 2018. Mm-hmm. So the formal part of the project, or the experiment, was ended in late 2015. I'd set the intention to take 500 formal experimental tests of the basic hypothesis.
So you're looking for events, I guess, that might affect what we would call global consciousness. I know occasionally there are events where maybe 1 billion people will be watching simultaneously on television.
Right. One of the prototypes that I did before starting the main project was Princess Diana's funeral. Mm-hmm. And it was said at the time that there would be probably more than 1 billion people, maybe 2 billion people, paying attention through radio, television, and even direct presence to this, to the funeral of Princess Diana. She was very much admired. There were tremendous numbers of people all over the world who thought highly of her. So I thought that would be a really good test of the notion that when a really large number of people share emotions, that we might get something like a consciousness field that could be registered somehow in the data from our random number generator. So I just asked all of my friends and colleagues who use random number generators, please take data, send it to me, and I put it all together, and we got one of those traces that is not a random trace when in the combined data.
A spike of some sort.
Well, a spike that lasted basically over the whole 6 hours of the funeral ceremonies. It's a spike, in this case, is just kind of a persistent deviation. Instead of wandering at the expected zero deviation level, it wandered a little bit above that all the time. And the typical way of sort of expressing that graphically is to add up the deviations cumulatively until we until we reach the end of the period for the formal experiment. And that's the same as testing for a z-score, or a significant difference between the expected value and the actual experimental value.
Now, I would imagine at this point, as you're just starting out to analyze the data, that statisticians and mathematicians will say, well, there are many different approaches you could have taken, and you likely be accused of, selecting post hoc the approach that worked the best.
Right. No, we knew those kinds of questions, and in fact, we had our own questions about what would be a suitable kind of statistical test, and we eventually settled on one primary test and then a couple of others that we might use for special purposes. But all of the data from the beginning, even when we were in what we call should properly call a pilot phase, were, the experiment required that we register all the parameters, the beginning of the period of time, the end of the period of time, and the statistical test that would be used. All of that had to be registered before the data were examined in any way. So it's been, that's a blessing, because you can then rely on the interpretation of your statistical outcomes. Whereas if you start after the fact, you look at the data and you say, oh, well, there's an interesting spike. I wonder what it is. A lot of people thought we should do that. Look through the data for interesting spikes. But it was clear to me from the beginning that if you do that, you will find some spikes, to be sure. And then if they're significant, you will say, wow, I wonder what it is. And then you can look at a very complicated, an enormous world. And you find 100 things, 1,000 things it might be.
Yeah, at any given moment, there's always something going on, especially worldwide. But that's
our protocol was set up so that we would get just a little statistical edge on the fact that there's going to be a great blossoming of activity in the world. We had our very precise definition, and we knew it wouldn't do to do this test only once. We knew so. The next time a similar event came along, we would do a very similar kind of definition of an experiment for that one, and gradually build up a kind of protocol, a set of results where, yes, there were other things happening in the world, but they're a little bit outside our boundary, the boundary of our preset experiment, or way outside. And so they would wash out, you might say. Whereas if we had something going on in the time period associated with some kind of an event, like, a great celebration or a great tragedy, we would gradually build up where if there were any response, it would gradually build up and become quite a clear response in a repeated experiment like that.
And anybody can now go to the website of the Global Consciousness Project and see some 500 different events enumerated, along with the statistical measurements that you made in each one of them, as well as the overall analysis.
Right. And in about maybe something like 2 months, they will be able to acquire a book that describes all this and gives wonderful examples of how it works, and a little bit of philosophy. So probably in February,
Well, I'm looking forward to that. And in fact, we can consider this interview sort of an advance announcement. So,
all right.
I'm sure many of our viewers will be interested in acquiring that book. My thought about what's going on, you mentioned Teilhard's concept of the noosphere, and it suggests to me that underlying our normal physical reality is something that physicists have occasionally called the quantum foam, a quantum mechanical level of reality beneath the normal atoms and molecules that make up our macro world. And it suggests that somehow when global consciousness in one way or another becomes coherent, the quantum foam itself is influenced, and that's what you're measuring.
I like that picture because it's very close to the closest I come to theorizing. I take my start from David Bohm, who, as you undoubtedly know, has a extremely well-developed and mathematically sound model describing what he calls the implicate order, which is a little like this quantum foam, in which everything exists in potential, but which is totally inaccessible to us, except when it becomes manifest in the world we know and love. And that happens, he says, because there is, if there's a need for some kind of if there's a need for information, or if there's a need for a new particle or whatever in our world, that can draw from the implicate order, guided by what he called a pilot wave and sometimes called active information. Mm. I'm personally 3/4 convinced that we human beings are all, and probably all conscious beings, are sources or centers of active information. What that amounts to is that, we extend out into the universe as a field of active information, potentially drawing things into being, or potentially adding some kind of information or structure to systems that need it. So, like, for example, if a person is a healer, and then there is somebody who might be 1,000 miles away who's ill or injured and therefore slightly randomized, no longer structured the way he or she is supposed to be, the healer, 1,000 miles away, can present to the universe a kind of intention, a structured notion of health and well-being for the 1,000-mile away healee, and by presenting that information, that structured information to the universe, it can go by way of active information to be absorbed into the system where it's needed to manifest the structure required for that person to become well or healed.
So currently, you must have, I'm guessing, a couple hundred eggs all over the planet.
Well, actually, the number of eggs that are active is gradually diminishing because I have not been adding new ones, and people, the hosts for the eggs need to do other things.
Yeah.
And I'm no longer running the formal experiment, but I am continuing to run it because it's kind of a beautiful thing. It's a tool or an instrument that exists which can be used to take a particular kind of look at the world.
Yeah,
it's not easy necessarily to interpret, but every time some big thing comes along, and I often hope that there will not be any. But there are.
Yeah.
I'm inclined to take a look at the data again, even though it's informal. I still use the same procedures of just defining the event before looking at the data, that sort of thing.
Do you have any future plans to do additional research other than what you've described?
Not really. I'm always hopeful, and occasionally there's an inkling of possibility that there will be somebody or multiple people come along with the idea that there's a pretty reasonable paradigm that might be pursued, and there might be better ways to do it, and so forth. And so I get communications from people who have this idea, and I try to help them think about the questions, and so I basically encourage replication.
Well, it would be great if this experiment could continue another 100 years. I think we would learn a lot.
Yeah. I don't think I will continue for another 100 years, unfortunately.
No, but
I'd love to see how things come out.
Maybe you'll have to come back, but I would hope that we could find young people in the field who would want to keep this sort of project going.
Well, there are a couple of people who, some of whom you may know. Adam Curry has built something he calls a consciousness app, and one of the things it could do is gather global consciousness-style data from lots and lots of mobile phones or mobile devices wandering around the world, and sending that all to a huge cloud database along with geographic information and the readings of the geomagnetic fluctuation levels and all kinds of things that might be correlated. No, things like what the peaking Google search words are, things like that.
Big data.
But that hasn't happened yet, and it requires substantial thought and maybe some serious investment of energies to make something like that go. There's a young man in your neighborhood, I think. I'm not sure, but he might be in Albuquerque, even named Brian Williams. I don't know if you've met him, but he's been doing a kind of mixture of field REG and GCP style experiments using data from my network for quite a few years. And he's one of the many people who have contributed actually analysis and useful extensions to my work. He, for example, put together a collection of all the what he termed global harmony events. These are things like meditations and religious holidays and anything that peace marches, that kind of thing. He found a little over 100 of those in my formal database, put them together asking, well, what does a global harmony context produce in these data? And what he found was a very strong 1 in 1,000 kind of deviation overall. Some of the things don't go in the direction we predict. Some go gangbusters in that direction. But the average over a large number of similar kinds of experiments is a good answer to the question whether that kind of event matters to the global consciousness network.
Well, you use the term paradigm, and it does seem to me that this line of research with the random event generators is a paradigm, and it's proven to be useful, and probably we've only begun to scratch the surface of what we might yet learn from this paradigm.
Oh, I totally agree. Especially, when I was wandering around with this, my little purse with a palm top computer and a random number generator and a lot of batteries, I was thinking of where all could I go? And I wanted to go to the space station. I wanted to go to the deathbed of people who were willing to be monitored as they were passing into the next domain. And so it's just like a completely endless unfolding matrix of potential questions. I've often thought about parapsychology and psychology, other sciences, as so like in the business of filling in squares in a giant matrix, which if it was all full, we would be able to put together a pretty nice understanding. But in parapsychology, it's a big matrix.
Yeah.
And there's only a little spot here and a little one here and a little one here that have been filled very, very well. So I'm hopeful that I would like my book. I've also published one in German that I would hope those might help people. And my website and my presence, anybody that wants to listen to me is going to get encouragement to pay attention to this kind of research at the edges of what we know. If that's where the good stuff is.
I would think some of the corporations dealing with big data, you mentioned Google as an example, would find that this would dovetail very nicely with the research they're already doing.
I would think so. And it may, people ask me sometimes, is the military interested? And I don't have any formal relationship with the military, but I know that long time ago they started looking. But I don't hear anything about it.
Yeah.
The same thing with Google. It's possible that they're interested, but it's a little bit like the main, parapsychologists often feel a little bit, I guess, sad because they can't get attention from mainstream researchers. It would be nice if there were more smart people looking at these questions. And I think a long time ago I decided that the real problem here is that everybody's already got a full plate.
Yeah.
And if you're a psychologist doing experiments on brain reactivity to flashing lights or whatever, that's what you do. And you don't have much room for somebody waving a random number generator at you. So there's probably less antipathy or hostility than we imagine, and more potential interest, but we have to somehow hope that we'll come up with some kind of experiment that just blows the socks off in such a way that people will say, wow, I got to try that myself. That's where most of us who have been in this field came from anyway.
In summary, it's fair to say you've been working with random event generators now since about 1980. That's close to 40 years, and you've consistently been getting significant data throughout that period.
I would say inconsistently getting significant data, because there are some very notable backwards performances.
Oh yeah,
and they're not uninstructive. They're very helpful. It turns out that meditation, certain kinds of meditation in the Global Consciousness Project database, typically have a downward trend. That is a negative deviation instead of the positive deviation we predict. So in the formal database, they subtract from our bottom line, but they're still there, of course. And in the laboratory experiments where you have, more refined controls over what happens, you can look for the variables that really matter. I'll give you just one quick example. We had an operator who we had two ways of choosing the intentions or having the intention. One would be I pick my own high versus low versus baseline next. The other mode is to have a random process. Tell me, it's now high, it's now baseline, now low. This person did magnificently well when choosing her own intention and direction, and went backwards as strongly as she had gone forwards when she was told what to do. You can see, it's only one case, but it's the kind of case that says, here's a good question to ask.
Yeah. And it also suggests that the individual signatures can give you some insight into the psychological makeup of that person.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
We even went so far as to speculate that we had a kind of mood detector or a psychological state detector for a while, but we, pursued that notion long enough to realize we were way ahead of the evidence.
It's the sort of thing that just requires more researchers and more research.
Yeah. And we'll look forward to seeing that.
Yeah. I mean, you've really kind of been carrying the ball along with a handful of a few dozen colleagues. But as you point out, now the formal research has ended. So it's time for other people to begin to take on the mantle that you have established.
Well, I hope that happens, and if that doesn't happen, then I hope something even better does.
Mm-hmm. Well, Roger Nelson, what a pleasure to share this time with you and to review a very important career in the history of parapsychology. Thanks for being with me.
Thank you so much for inviting me to this conversation, Jeff, and I wish you the best for the holidays.
The same to you.
Book 3 in the new Thinking Aloud dialogue series is UFOs and UAP, Are We Really Alone? Now available on Amazon.
You can now download a free PDF copy of issue number 8 of the new Thinking Aloud magazine, or order a beautiful printed copy. Go to newthinkingaloud.org